revolts. And you were telling me that most of the revolts were pretty well organized, and that Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey were just two of many that took place. What period did they peak? In what period did these revolts and rebellions peak?
Well, there were various periods. The revolts come in waves. I could explain that if we had time, but for instance, from 1720 to about 23, 1737 to 1742, 1790 to 1802, 1827 to 1831. 1850 to 60 is an enormous period of unrest. So I cannot say to you that one peaked. It's valleys and mountains, valleys and mountains. If there is such a thing as a culmination, it's the decade before the Civil War. Why do they come in waves? Because one reason is that people get tired. You have to have a new generation.
And repression.
Yeah, the repression is so merciless, and the victims are so numerous, and they hung their heads up on poles from, for hundreds of yards.
Their heads were cut off and hung?
Yes, most often heads were cut up and hung as warning, just like the Romans did in ancient slavery. And it was a fierce repression, and then the sale of the families of rebels, and it was murder, awful. So that you'd have to have a period of recovery, and then new young people growing up and deciding it was better to die than live this way, which of course was what was required for rebellion. Rebellion was no joke. Everything was geared by the slave owners to suppress rebellion or prevent rebellion, and this was the ultimate crime, of course, unforgivable, and therefore the punishment was as severe as possible. Torture, public torture, hanging up in cages and starving to death, crucifying, burning, whatever one's imagination could conceive was done. It was also waived because there was particular sources, for instance, a depression, an economic depression. The slaves suffered. Families were broken up. Rations were reduced. Militancy rose. Or political excitement. I told you the other time about a new governor coming, or the French and Indian War, or the American Revolution, or the Mexican War, or some campaign like 1856. The slogan of the new Republican Party was "Free Men, Free Soil, and Fremont" was the name of the candidate. Well, slaves heard that and decided we must be involved. Surely they are not talking about free men and free soil and Fremont without us. Well, they were, but the slaves couldn't believe that. One slave was beaten to death in Tennessee in 1856, and the newspapers said he screamed, lay on harder, Fremontiers, Fremontiers." So it came in waves.
Where does John Brown fit into this scenario?
As a culmination.
Well, the movies depict him as some raving
maniac.
Yeah.
Yes. Why is he a maniac? Because he's a white man who devotes his life to the liberation of slaves. That's why he's a maniac. Those white people like Edmund Ruffin and John C. Calhoun, who devoted their life to the maintenance of slavery, they're not maniacs. They're United States senators. They're rich slave owners. But in this country, you have to be a maniac if you're white to devote yourself to the liberation of black people and give your life to it. Let me tell you a story about John Brown. May I?
Sure.
I was once lecturing, I don't know what genius organized this, but I was lecturing on John Brown to about 150 black kids, high school kids, in Oakland, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, years ago, 15 years ago. So I lectured on John Brown. When I finished, a little black kid came up to me. He must have been 13. Small little fella. He says to me, excuse me, he says, did I understand you right? Did you say John Brown was white? Nobody ever asked me that question before. I said, why, yes, he was white. And the kid said, holy Jesus, that blows my mind. And I thought to myself, what a tragedy. What a tragedy that the black child thinks it is impossible that a white person would have given his life to free his people. By the way, that changed a large part of my life too, because since then I've been, among other things, devoting myself to the determination to write a book on the history of anti-racism in the United States. Mm-hmm. And of course, Brown is the emblem of that.
Mm-hmm. Before we go into John Brown, I just want to ask you a question. Many who are reminded of the institution of slavery say, I don't want to hear that anymore.
Yes.
I'm not involved in it.
Yes.
I was never involved in it. This is now. I'm tired of hearing about that. In your analysis, how has the institution of slavery affected white citizens in the United States? Or has it at all?
It has. It depends on the way it's taught. Historically, it has been taught as characteristic of black people. The historiography predominantly, certainly until 1960, epitomized by the work of Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, held that slavery was delightful, that those held in slavery were natural slaves, black people, that they, unique among all the peoples of the world, loved it, just relished it, and that therefore abolitionism was crazy, misinformed, had no idea of the marvelous benevolence of the slave institution, where the masters were doing the slaves a favor, and the slaves were naturally inferior, and therefore the position of inferiority and superiority was not oppressive but a natural condition. In fact, it was a benevolent situation. The propaganda of the masters was, we can't free the slaves because who'll take care of them? Who'll take care of the slaves? Well, of course, historically, the slaves have been taking care of the whites, making their beds and feeding them and making heat and everything else, growing their cotton, making their money, taking care of them. But the way it was taught in a racist society was racist historiography. Now, I think this is one of the reasons that so many black people say we're disgusted with it. I don't think they would be disgusted with knowledge of a monumental history of resistance, that they forged a revolutionary past second to no people on earth. How can a people be ashamed of that? But if you are taught the opposite, black people are taught that too. We're taught that also, the books and so on.
I was actually asking you, though, the question in terms of whites who say that. I don't want to hear any more about slavery. That's past and whatnot. And I wanted you to tell me in your analysis how the reality of slavery has affected or infected whites to this very day.
I believe that it has been, the way it is taught, it has been a main ingredient to the racist content of white brains. That they were taught that the blacks were naturally servile, docile, passive, imitative. And this confirmed the racism which was endemic and organic to the society. And it helped make life more comfortable for white people.
And it has affected attitudes to this day.
Certainly. The fact that they are subordinate, the fact that they are 3 times more unemployed, that black women in maternity die 2.5 times more than white people, and so on and so forth, that they earn half. Well, naturally they do.
Mm-hmm. Back to John Brown. Who was John Brown, and where did he grow up, and who influenced him?
Well, Brown is a product of Connecticut. He's born in 1800. He's a New Englander, religious. Religion is a great influence, but it's what we now call the theology of liberation. There's nothing new about the theology of liberation. Theology of liberation goes back to the beginning. Christ was a liberationist, and Brown was. This was a decisive influence in his life.
What did he do for a living?
What did he do for a living? Many things. He was a farmer. He was a tanner. He was a shepherd.
In the New England states, or did he move south?
He moved in what we now call the Midwest. In Ohio, Indiana. He moved a great deal, trying to make a living, as so many other people did. In that sense, he was characteristic. Now, he saw slavery fairly early, and he thought it was a violation of the Ten Commandments, that it was the sum of all villainies, as he frequently said. Why in his precise case probably cannot be determined. Who knows? Who knows your motivations? Do you know your motivations? I'm not sure.
Only some. No, only a few.
Yeah. So one of the most difficult things in the world for a psychologist, let alone a historian, is to determine motivation.
Was there anything that happened that sort of triggered that you're aware of?
Well, it is said so. He is supposed to have seen slaves maltreated, and a coffle of slaves seemed to him outrageous. But then you ask why? Thousands of others saw it. The same legend, perhaps it's a legend, holds with Lincoln. Lincoln on a boat, working on a boat, is alleged to have seen some of the worst features of slavery and pledged himself to do what he could to destroy it. This may be apocryphal, but things influence people in different ways.
Okay, let's take a break. I've got some more to ask you about him. We'll be back.